So happy to see everybody here. Native Roots Network, as Radley mentioned, has been doing a number of different projects for 20 some odd years now. And I like the way Indian Collective encapsulates the different areas that they focus on, and that's decolonize, defend, and develop. And so much of our work has been involved with decolonizing and defending, and that work is ongoing, and it's probably likely going to have to be something we continue. But one of the things that we learned probably, as he was saying, those projects would happen, and then what were we doing, and I've heard this before, to take care of the material needs of the people. And so, then we started down the pathway of looking at different things like social enterprise development, and we took an adult cohort over to kind of check that out in Hawaii. And we've taken folks over to Culture Shift in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And we've taken people over to Allied Media Conference in Detroit. And we've learned a lot. And what we have found over time is this thing that we do as Indigenous people, and many communities do within their own villages, as you might call them, is we take care of one another. And I didn't know that there was a term called solidarity economy, but that's essentially what it is. And one of my other co-conspirators who's back there, is we talked about man, we should have a liberatory potluck. We should totally get people together and start talking about this and change the system. And now we're at a place where we've learned from folks at Cooperation Humboldt, Cooperation Jackson, the different things that people are doing, not just in this nation, but around the world. And so those are some of the things that, while those lessons are lessons and they're not necessarily all applicable to our place, we can learn from them and make those lessons work for us where we are. And as Jonathan had mentioned, here, I'm from Hawaii. And actually, no matter where I am, my kuleana is to take care of the Aina. And the Aina is the land, but we are the land. And so we have a responsibility to that land, and here I am. So I have a responsibility to this place. And I take that very seriously, and I think all of us do. And I just really am deeply appreciative of that. And I think, there's a saying, he ali'i ka Aina, he kaua ke kanaka. The land is chief, but the people are the servants. And I'm looking at Pedro now. Perfect, I land on you when I say that. And today, we're really fortunate to have Kali with us. And he has such a long, history of things that he's done. Sorry, but I'm going to read it, because I cannot do that off the cuff. Kali Akuno is co-founder and co-director of Cooperation Jackson, a network of worker cooperatives and community-led programs. I ripped this off from somebody who did a really good job on your bio. That sustain and grow a democratic, just, and sustainable economy in Jackson, Mississippi. Among these programs is the Fannie Lou Hammer, right? Is how I say it, right? Community Land Trust, which allows community members to collectively steward the land and creates opportunities for affordable property ownership. Kali served as the Director of Special Projects and External Funding in the mayoral administration of the late Chokwe Lumumba of Jackson, Mississippi. His focus in this role was supporting cooperative development, the introduction of eco-friendly and carbon reduction methods of operation, and the promotion of human rights and international relations for the city. Kali is co-editor of Jackson Rising, The Struggle for Economic Democracy and Black Self-Determination in Jackson, Mississippi, another book that you might want to consider. And I'm sorry, but there are only 2 books of Jackson Rising Redux, so if you want to get them, it would be fun to watch you fist fight back there. Cooperatively. And the author of numerous articles and pamphlets, including the Jackson Kush Plan, The Struggle for Black Self-Determination and Economic Democracy. Until We Win, Black Labor and Liberation in the Disposable Era, Operation Ghetto Storm, Every 28 Hours Report, and Let Your Motto Be Resistance, a handbook on organizing new African and oppressed communities for self-defense. He has served as the co-director of the U.S. Human Rights Network, the executive director of the People's Hurricane Relief Fund, based in New Orleans, Louisiana, after Hurricane Katrina. He was a co-founder of the School of Social Justice and Community Development, a public school serving the academic needs of low-income African American and Latino communities in Oakland, California. As of August 2021, Kali has been working as Racial and Environmental Justice Coordinator at the Institute for Social Ecology, which provides community-based educational programs, popular education, and organizing assistance to social and political movements informed by a community-centered vision of positive, ecologically oriented social change. With that, Kali.
Thank you. My head is big.
Oh, look here, look, it's adjustable. Here, have it 1 second.
Sure.
I was telling Michelle that this particular abalone piece looks like a paua, which is a tongue in Hawaii that is only something that you can wear if you have the authority to speak. And it just seemed fitting for you.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank all of you for coming and being here and allowing me to be in your community and to speak. I do want to start by sending word of my comrade and co-conspirator and wife, Sacagawea, who couldn't be here, unfortunately, because our son, Tecumseh, he had a bad accident and got a concussion. And so it wasn't feeling well. So, and we were really looking forward to be here and to kind of like be together, because we don't often get a chance to travel with each other and like do these speaking tours, usually like one or the other. And so being together is somewhat unique for us. And for that, I have to give thanks to Lorraine Marie, who is my mother, for joining us so that we had some time available, and to give and honor respect to all the reproductive labor that's often unseen, unacknowledged, or erased, that makes all of this what we do possible. So I just want to start with that and acknowledge and give her greetings, because she definitely wanted to be here. So let me start just to situate myself. For those of you who may not know, I'm a California boy, actually. I was born and raised, I say in Watts, y'all might call it Los Angeles, but I was born in Watts on Corrosis Avenue. To a set of parents that only could kind of come together like in the uniqueness of post-World War II Los Angeles. So my dad's folks are from Oklahoma and from Mexico, and my mama's folks are from Louisiana and Mississippi. And you only kind of get that conjuncture of all these kind of weird folks coming together in that kind of little brief period of time. But it frames a lot of both who I am and also continuing to what I'm doing now. And so this piece, on a certain level, because of my grandparents' ancestry, there's a couple of different places I could and do reference and call home, but there's a particular fondness and also rootedness for me about Mississippi. And one of the things about Mississippi that we can trace, and our family is very proud of, on my mother's side, there's the French colonized a portion of the river, and they called it Natchez, Mississippi. And Natchez is a little bit older in terms of it being a European settlement than New Orleans. And my family has been there since before it became Natchez. And we still have a direct line that's still there to this day. So for me, there's a deep part of going to Mississippi, which is about going back home and doing justice to there, because my family is one of many that were burnt out and chased out and got to Mississippi, got to Los Angeles in part so that the white folks that they were fighting back against wouldn't kill everybody, right? So me going back and doing the work I'm doing now is a part of both reclaiming that legacy, but also doing right by the land and trying to restore both relationship and to leave something for the future generations. So just to put that in context, it's not by accident that I got to where I'm at or I'm doing what I'm doing. There's a long thread. And one of the pieces I'd like to really share about our work around, Cooperation Jackson. People kind of sometimes come and look at our community, and particularly some of the things we have as a kind of like a ragtag social little movement is like, that's amazing how you guys put all that stuff together. And they think just because our organization it'll be 10 years old come May Day, May 1st of 2024, people think like, oh, y'all did all this in 10 years. Like, if you believe that, then you're missing the boat. You don't quite understand, what it takes to do work, and that we are part of an intergenerational struggle. And there was a movement of folks that we are descended directly from that laid a foundation that goes back about 50 years. And so if you don't, if you just see the immediate thing, you don't quite understand what it takes to actually build something and the intergenerational nature of it. And that, if anything, we always say, we're not doing anything new. So try to dispel people, if there's anything new about what we're doing, is that we just kind of put together a particular order of operations to fit our space, time, and conditions, right? And that's it. Because all the different things that we are talking about in terms of solidarity economy and all those different things, I can tell you in Mississippi alone, generations of stories of folks who were doing collective farming, collective things, some of which worked, some of which was not allowed to work, right? People being burnt out, the land being stole, things being dispossessed. I can tell you a whole bunch of stories about that. We just fit a particular piece because of how we've took the time to analyze our situation and just try to come up with things that will be effective to move things from point A to point B. And one of the things that was, for me, very transformative about the course I'm on, which I'm glad Jonathan brought it up, was actually going down to Chiapas in 1994, shortly after the January 1st uprising that folks had committed themselves to, and being totally bewildered by what I was seeing and trying to understand. I come from a very, very generational family, has been in the movement, quote unquote, for a long time. And so I'm a child of the movement, and I have folks who are in exile now. I have folks who are in prison now, who are political prisoners and prisoners of war, political exile. And I come from, to name it for those who might not be familiar, I come from a tendency of the Black liberation movement called the New African Independence Movement. And this is a movement that had been struggling primarily to try to claim a level of self-determination and independence from the United States government in South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana specifically, right? And folks engaged in a whole bunch of different ways and methods of struggle in the course of doing that in the 60s and 70s, in particular including some elements of armed struggle, just so folks are clear about that. And we come out directly of that. I'm a child of that, saw that, witnessed that, experienced that, FBI knocking down my door, hunting for folks. One of my earliest memories is the FBI knocking down my mama's door and putting the gun in her face and arresting her. It's one of my earliest memories. So a long history of struggle in my family and of this movement in particular. And that is a grounding that I want you all to understand when you read that book, or if you pick it up and you chance to look at our work, to understand some elements of those foundations. But Jackson in particular Let me tell you a little something about Jackson and how we wound up being there. So in 1968, there was a conference that was held in Detroit, and it was called the Black Self-Governance Conference, right? And this is the period of the Black Power movement. And out of that conference, an earlier generation gave it some definition, a generation that kind of came of age in the 1930s. And they said it's not just about, governance in the abstract that, many of y'all might have heard a phrase from Malcolm X called land is the basis of independence. Well, he got this from his earlier generation. And they said, look, we need to focus in on a return to the land. And we need to be clear about identifying that. And where have the majority of our folks been? Where are our bones? They resided in those 5 states that we had mentioned. And that is a place that we should try to struggle from. And they declared independence at this conference in 1968 and declared that they were establishing the Republic of New Africa. Then in 1970, so they declared this and they set up a government, basically a provisional government and a government in exile. And they declared in 1970 that they were going to, element of them were going to make an effort to actually start building a base on the land, or what people call the national territory, and move to Mississippi. And in 1971, there wound up being a major shootout that happened in Jackson, Mississippi, in a house that's literally right around the corner from my house, which is not by accident, where the FBI, the Mississippi Bureau of Police, and the Jackson Police Department basically came and tried to move these people out and basically annihilate them. And unfortunately, in that gathering, it lasted 2 days. There were 2 police officers who got killed and 1 FBI agent who got hurt. And they arrested every person who was in that house. It was about 31, and they put 11 of them on trial. 8 of them wound up going to prison and doing between, 8 years was the minimum, and 20 years, including one of the key people who was then the president of this provisional government, who wasn't even in Mississippi at the time. He wound up doing 8 years. And so we pick up on that. And our community land trust, the Faneuil-Hemmer Community Land Trust, which was mentioned, is situated in that very organizing community, and not by chance, because there's still that intergenerational base of folks who are, or continue to try to struggle along these ideas. They are there, and we are just like the children and grandchildren who've tried to pick up a torch and say, okay, we love and honor and appreciate all of what you did, all the sacrifices you made, and we have to figure out how to learn the lessons of what you did right and what you did wrong, and figuring out how to deal with an enemy which is uncompromising and unforgiving, right? And how do we don't want another generation that's going to be tied up in prison, so how do we engage and struggle now to advance some things? And we came up with a strategy which is conditioned upon all these things that we learned from the Zapatistas and everybody. A lot of struggle. I mean, the organization that put this in, we struggled anybody and everybody, to try to figure some things. But then, one of the key things of why I bring up the Zapatistas was quickly learning their general principles, but then there's things that are particular to our community. And we can't copy wholesale what somebody else is doing. We have to figure out what works for us. And it's not just like what works for us mechanically, like what works within our cultural framework, right? What do the people understand, right? And what is their vision? What do they want? And how do we fit in, to both undermine the structures that are pitted against us, but enable us to have the kind of the time, space, and energy to move in the way that we want to move. And so this Jackson Kush plan is an articulation of how we thought we could move on this. And so Cooperation Jackson was born as a component of that particular strategy, right? An element of that particular strategy. And it was to develop particularly the solidarity economy portion of it. And to move to the piece of where that starts for us is trying to be first and foremost in right relationship with the land. So the piece around like trying to understand the strategies for like a just transition or climate strategies, the first piece is transforming our relationship with the land. That is what we've anchored in. And so a lot of people kind of look at us and they're like, they look at the co-ops and they look at some other stuff and we say, that's good to focus on that. But if you don't understand our relationship to the land, you kind of actually miss the picture. Right? And if you look at where we've spent the vast majority of our resources, you know, and our time, it's actually been in getting back into like our strategy around our community land trust is premised on this whole piece of we want to try to acquire as much land in the community as possible, to take it off the speculative market and to hold it in common. Right? So there is no individual ownership within our community land trust. There's negotiated use agreements, right, that we have based upon, you know, different aspects of need. But there is no individual ownership. And we've been very clear and very intentional about that. And what we tried to prioritize a lot of times, like with our housing, the first goes to primarily, you know, single mothers and the elders. Those are the first two, like within our criteria, like first two of who do we need to take care of to make sure that they have the ability to actually live in peace and dignity and be able to afford the things that we afford. Just given the issues that permeate our community, those are the two, you know, primary groups that we focus on and then try to build from there. But the critical piece is, you know, we say that we're at this, what we call the decommodification stage, but there's a deeper part, which is the decolonization stage. And that's another level of piece that we're going to have to work on. And so when I was telling you about Jackson, it's very critical for everybody to understand some of the history. So Jackson is the capital of the state of Mississippi. And if you don't know, it's named after Andrew Jackson, who was a terrible human being. Hitler was modeled after him in many respects. But the original Choctaw name of the place is Chisafoxa, right? And it sits on what, you know, is known as the Natchez Trace Trail. And it's bounded on its eastern border by the Pearl River. And it was a primarily gathering and trading place, right, for many years within the great, we followed the academic, the great kind of mound culture around the Mississippi area. And there are tons of mounds, a good number of which have, you know, like, and these mounds, to be clear, I'm using that language, I shouldn't. These were basically pyramid structures that had gotten built, right, that the European settlers intentionally just dismantled, like over a period of time. And they stick out very obviously because Mississippi is one of the flattest pieces of real estate on the planet, right? Most of it is actually below the sea level. And the highest natural feature in Mississippi is only 100 feet above sea level. So it's flat, right? It's pretty flat. And so when something sticks up in certain areas, still to this day, you can kind of feature like, no, somebody did that on purpose, right? They built that on purpose. And if you look at there's not enough kind of like scholarship or interest, nor a lot of times the way that the land is held, people don't allow people to kind of go back and the Europeans who own this and turn it into these big cotton plantations, which dominated the economy for so long, they don't allow people to come in and do kind of this investigation, in part because they don't want anybody to have an understanding of what preceded them and understand the claims. Choctaw folks are doing that work, of course, but the access and the struggle to it is very limited. But we are always trying to be like, reclaim that and understand, like, no, we are on a foundation, right, that was laid before us, and we don't just need to know, like, the settler history, we need to know the deeper history, because without that, we actually can't get right with the land, right? And for us, it's a piece of, like, not just figuring out, because there's a way in which people approach some of this, which is just figure out what crops, cash crops grow best, right? And that's still how you get right with the land. It's like, well, no, some of these cash crops ain't from here, right? A good number of them are not from here. And while they may grow well in the soil, and under these conditions, they actually require a lot more of like fertilizer and other things because they're not native, they're not indigenous to this particular place. And so we need to understand that if we're really going to try to totally fix this. So for us, it's not just like acknowledgement for acknowledgment's sake or positionality. Like there's an actual knowledge and spirit that flows through this that we need to be in tune with. So that's a deep part of our growing understanding, not just of agroecology or permaculture, as some people used to call it, but a deeper level of that we're trying to like kind of grow into and build as a foundation for us. But it starts with this, and we're trying to make an argument within the solidarity economy movement on the whole that how you do kind of what we call just transition work starts there, right? What's your actual relationship with land and place, and what is your relationship to it? And if we change the way in which we orient the place, particularly its commodification, that is the beginning place of deconstructing the systems that confine us and contain us and put us in this structural position where we're exploited, excluded, and oppressed. And it's changing that fundamental piece that we think is foundational to anything else that you want to build upon, like a workers' cooperative or time bank or anything of that nature. So that is the root for us to understand where I think what we've done the best at. And we didn't arrive there just like through, let me just dispel this notion that like we were some wise piece. We got there through trial and error, right? By making mistakes and then kind of figuring out like over time. So I've been doing co-ops for a good minute, and one of the first co-ops I did was actually here in California in Sacramento. It's called the Thomas Moss Memorial Co-op. And Thomas Moss, for those you want to look him up, he did the People's Grocery in Memphis, Tennessee, which is right on the border with Mississippi. So again, my deep association with Mississippi. And a Mississippi woman by the name of Ida B. Wells, y'all might have heard of her. She started the anti-lynching campaign. Well, she's from Mississippi. She's not. Most people don't know that. She's from Mississippi, and she was working with the People's Grocery with Thomas Moss, and she started her campaign about Thomas Moss's assassination by the Klan when they came and burned out the People's Grocery for competing with a white man's grocery, right? And that's how she started her anti-lynching campaign, was really in respect to her own work and that of a friend in the community, and then launched this kind of national campaign after that kind of got going. So knowing some of this history, we said we want to start this local kind of community food-oriented co-op. This was in 1993, 94. And was young, I think it was, 23, 24 doing this. And my mama used to do basically what we now call like a CSA. They didn't call it that then. It was just all the women were growing food and trading it amongst each other, and everybody got a box. That's how I understood it. And they were like, oh, that was a co-op. That's what y'all basically had without using that name, but that's how we survived, right? So I took that knowledge in and tried to do this, but we were working on this white guy's land on the outskirts of kind of Sacramento, and he was underutilizing it. At first, he was really good to us, but as we kind of started to figure out what we were doing, he started raising the price on us, the rent on us, like every 6 months, right? And so it got to the point like once we moved from just being young and hard working to be like, okay, there's a method to this, there's a discipline to this, and we started to be disciplined and started making a little bit of money. We kind of figured out after about a year, we're working for you now. We're not working for the community. We're working to pay your rent. And so one of the things I walked out of there after of a year and a half of paying him rent and making him, get a little richer, I walked away when we all just said, hey, we need to disband this because it's not actually serving us. It's not serving this community in a particular way. I walked out of there saying, Key Less, don't ever rent again, right? And I didn't quite figure out how to not do that. But it set the seed, at least in my head, and the folks I was working with, like we need to save our money, set up things aside so that we ever get another opportunity like this again, we can just kind of buy it outright. And that's a critical thing that we did in Jackson under the conditions to really set this framework. Now, most of what I'm talking about may not sound like, on the surface, it may not sound like climate justice orientation at all. And I would argue, yes, it is. Right? Because now, we get to set the terms of how we grow, what we grow, and in what method. And one of the critical things about how we're going to correct our situation with get out of the climate, we got to restore our soils and we got to engage in a different method of production. Right? We cannot go on with this industrial mode of agriculture to feed the world's people. Because in truth, I don't know if folks know this, but I want you to look it up if you don't believe me. Most of the world's food is actually still produced by small farmers. Did y'all know that? Right? Most of the world's food is actually still produced by small farmers, roughly about 60%. Not by the big agricultural companies, that they would have you believe that. Now, they are some of the world's worst polluters, right, by far, and the destroyers of our ecosystem, and they're doing all that, and they don't even feed the vast majority of the world's people, right? And then, truth be told, like you got like you're here in the United States, we grow enough. I'm using we in a broad sense, but folks, producers. Let me change it to be more precise. Producers in the United States produce enough corn on average to feed the world every year. But you know where most of that feed goes into? Pigs and cows, right? And that is to feed a small portion of the planet meat every day. A small portion of the planet. We're talking about mainly people in the United States, in Western Europe, in Japan, Korea, Australia, right, who have this heavy consumption of meat. So most of the world don't even get to benefit, if you want to consider that a benefit, of eating that much meat as much as we consume. That's a rarity. But yet more than half of the world's produce feed is done in that particular way. Does that make any logical sense? No. Right? And you can go down. Soybeans, how much of that is produced in the United States and is now in the good part of the corn is actually used for gas, right? So if we want to change these systems, it starts with us changing up our fundamental relationship with the land. And anybody thinking about, like, how do we deal with all these the climate policies on a practical level of what we all can do is starting there. Right? And then from there fighting for the other things that need to be transformed in what we produce and how we produce. And for us, one of the critical things that we are trying to transition into is, number one, like the worker co-op piece. It's actually better, and I want you guys to think about it in this way, it's actually better to think about is worker self-organization. Because co-ops may not be the way it actually functions best in your particular community or relationship. But to the degree that people get to determine when they work, how they work, what they are producing, right, that's the self-organization. And that can come in a number of different forms. And oftentimes we'll have to. And we are trying to stress that primarily because there are some groups of people who cannot form legal entities called cooperatives, right? Immigrants, for instance, a lot of immigrants, at least in Mississippi, they can't do that, right? Because without quote-unquote papers, they can't actually engage in legal activity. of that nature are registered with the state, but are doing it in a collective way. That's also true for a good number of black folks, right? Folks who on papers called, your prison release papers, right? Who are excluded from the formal economy in so many different ways, which is big in my community. So, just so you know, I didn't talk about Jackson I mentioned it's the capital. It's over 80% black, right? And it's poor as dirt, right? More than half the community is either at or below the official poverty line, right? And I would say in reality, more than 50% of our community is unemployed. Like the real unemployment, not what they tell you with the statistics. If you're not familiar with how the United States government actually does unemployment statistics, it's just counting the people who actually show up to register that they're looking for work, right? And that only typically within a 6-month period, which means there's millions of people who just stop showing up and register who just don't work. And that you see that in my community in abundance. And then we have, I was telling some people earlier, just to give you a picture, there's 60,000, right now, and our city is shrinking, unfortunately, and shrinking rapidly. There was a USA Today report that came out, and the news, we covered it as well. Jackson is now being known as the fastest shrinking city in the United States. So in 2010, the census said that we had 205,000 people. And when we were in government a couple of years later, we figured out it was more like 220,000 people. And how did we figure that out? We actually traced how many, the water meters, how many people were using water, as opposed to what the government counted. And I come from a community where a lot of older black folks in particular, they don't like being counted by the United States government, right? And never have, and kind of never will. But I believe, everybody got a drink, so I believe the water department more than I believe the U.S. Census. So we went from about like 220 people to now we're somewhere between like 150 to 160, just within the course of a decade. And part of the reason why we are having a severe water crisis, and this is probably not new to a lot of communities, but our water infrastructure, the source, we're different than, say, like Flint. Flint, the source was bad because they made a choice to go to a polluted source. Ours is the opposite. The source is good. It's the old infrastructure. The pipes are old lead pipes, right? And so the delivery mechanism is just poisonous, but the source is good. But to dig out all these old pipes and put in, like new ones, and every day this is going up. It costs roughly, the projected cost was a year ago was about $6 billion. The latest cost is about $8.5 billion, just in the course of a year of it going up. Now Jackson, our annual city budget is only about $800 million max. That means that if we spent every penny just on fixing the water, it would take us about 15 years to cover the cost, and we wouldn't have any other social services, period. So folks are having to make some real hard choices in our community. Do I stay here with my kids and drink contaminated water, or do I go someplace else? Right? And in our case, we are very clear. Our city does not have the capacity to fund that, like I just told you. We don't have the capacity to fund that on our own. Our state government, is not going to pass anything to benefit Jackson. Point blank, period. I've been very kind and not sparing y'all that, but we live in a state where there's a Republican super majority. There is not, to give you a sense of what I mean, there is not a Democrat who holds a statewide office, period. Not a one. Not a one, okay? In a state that has more black people than any other state in it. So this is just effective gerrymandering that they've done. This has not always been the case. This has only been in the last 20 years that they've been able to kind of reconstruct the boundaries and the barriers. But Mississippi, so y'all have an understanding, even according to the U.S. Census, is 40% black, the state. And out of every 4 black politicians in the country is from Mississippi. So, let me repeat that. 1 out of every 4 black politicians in this country is in Mississippi. And so we exist in a place where there's a tremendous amount of registered self-interest engaged in electoral politics to get people put in certain offices, but the offices do not yield a level of actual political power enough to kind of change the material circumstances. And so it's largely a defensive measure in truth of how this electoral piece works in our state. So you go like up in the Delta, and almost all the sheriffs there are black, whatever the situation is. They are black in defense of kind of white terror organizations, so folks are very clear, right? And so, for us, we've been, one of the jokes that happened when Trump got elected, we said that now everybody lives in Mississippi. Y'all get a taste of what we've been living with for a long time, right? And by the standard of the politicians that we have, if y'all feel his rhetoric is sometimes over the top, he's mild compared to the stuff that we've been listening to and have to deal with for a long time. So we've learned to kind of how do you move and maneuver in a particular context where it may seem like it's impossible to move or it's hopeless. No, it's not. There's ways through solid community organization and building unity the community that you can actually do a lot of different things. And so one of the things that we put out, and I'm gonna stop in a second and open up for questions. So we put out when we shortly after we were founded and got the operation. We very intentionally tried to create co-ops that were in a kind of a cycle of not wasting anything, that were in relationship with each other, so that we would grow the food. We had we have a co-op, Freedom Farm was grows through Urban Farming Cooperative. We have a composting and recycling cooperative to kind of utilize any waste around that, and then we had a cafe, and so there was kind of a very integrated system of how do we recycle and return everything back in order and leave nothing unused, and that's a model that we encourage folks to do. And to utilize. So it's building with a certain type of intentionality. And so the way in which to be clear, the way in which we've attempted to do co-ops is very different than a lot of the way that other people do. So a lot of co-op development is like, just find people who are interested in what you're interested in, and y'all work from your passion to make that into like an enterprise that you can earn some income in. We took another perspective. Ours is, we did a broad community survey of what's needed, and then we're going to build something around that, right? We're going to build something to serve that particular need. Now, to be clear, it has its strengths and its weaknesses. And one of the weaknesses with that is we often have people who are not working in their passion in certain regards. And so that means that there's a high level of turnover. And so to give you a concrete example, we have a lot of young people over the course of about 10 years who've learned how to farm. But many of them decided, I'm not a farmer. I don't like getting up at 4 o'clock in the morning, every day. And in Mississippi, if you want to farm smart, you got to get up about 4 o'clock in the morning to get out there, because you don't want to be working in 100-degree humid temperatures. I'm from Mississippi heat and California heat are different, if y'all not aware. Very different from each other, right? You're gonna lose about 10 pounds every day in Mississippi heat, because it's just going to sweat out you if you're in it for too long. So if you want to be out there and be effective, you get up by 4 o'clock in the morning, you try to finish everything you're doing by 9, right? And then you want to close shop and do certain things starting by 4 or 5 o'clock to, kind of tend to some things. Well, a lot of our young folks this is good, I can do 2 or 3 years, and then I want to do something else, because this is hard work. And so it's intentional about moving forward our food sovereignty objectives, but it's not always the passion of what certain people have. And so this is kind of the thing that we're trying to figure out how to adjust around meeting certain needs, but also meeting people's passions so that the people are anchored and want to stay, for a long time. So any model that you choose or you adopt is going to have strength and going to have weaknesses. You have to figure out how to, mix and match them, just to be aware. But ours are very much intentional. It's not co-ops for co-op's sakes. It's like there are some solid needs to help us get to a point where we can be self-determined that is what our model is based upon. Like fundamentally. And for us, it's like we're not going to break for that for $1. We're not going to break for that because some corporation comes around and says, oh, if y'all work for us and do X, Y, and Z. And we've had all that. Like, oh, y'all can work for us as a sub. Like, no, we used to, we come from people who used to work on plantations. So you offering another plantation condition actually, made you unappealing from the beginning. Like just off the top. So, but there's an integrated way in which we encourage us to do this framework in the solidarity economy that gets us to the broader objective, right, of being able to implement a just transition. And it's something that we would argue you have to do intentionally. Can't leave it to chance. Right? And that also means you kind of got to think beyond just the regular dictates of the market. And this is the point I want to kind of just end on and open up the questions. Because a lot of the stuff that our co-ops, they're like, we want people to have the best livelihood and employment that they can have. Right? That is a necessary thing to live in this society, and we still are embedded within it. But we're very clear, ours are not focused on profit maximization at all. That is not the aim and result to us. Our measure of how we measure success, number one, is how many people are we serving? How many people are we providing food to? What is the material impact that our productive capacity is yielding to the community? Rather, not so much how much money we are making. Like, we do the balance sheets, we do all that, because we still, we're not supplying all of our own material needs. We still have to engage with seeds or equipment so we still have to, make some money to be able to do some of the things we want to do. But we're very clear that we're trying to get to a point where each year we're kind of less and less dependent upon market transactions because we're increasing our own productive capacity to do those things amongst ourselves. And that's the piece that I didn't get a chance to talk about, this community production piece of why that's real central to us, and we think is very central. And this community production is us being able to produce the fundamental tools that we need with the new kind of technologies appropriately utilized within our context, so we don't have to be dependent upon all these external markets and all the carbon trails and everything that comes with that. But it's not like we're just going to produce 1 million of these, tools because we can sell 1 million of these tools. Like, no, we're going to produce the tools that we need to satisfy what's going on within our community so that we can live a better quality life. And not have to deal with all these external, kind of forces and dynamics. And it's not, I want folks to be clear, we're not into this kind of autocracy of like, we just want to separate ourselves from the world. That's not what I'm talking about, right? We see ourselves as global, grounded, global citizens. That's how we see ourselves. Like we have to have our feet planted firmly on the ground, but we want to be interconnected. But there's a way in which the modern world economy has been structured. Let's be real, it's not sustainable. And let me give you an example. Mississippi, one of its major crops, if you want to call it that, it's kind of absurd to call it that. But Mississippi it used to be half of the catfish in the world were produced in Mississippi. Right? That kind of ended in the mid-90s. Now only 1/4 of the world's catfish are produced in Mississippi, which is still a lot. Okay? Do y'all know there's not one wholesale catfish processing plant in Mississippi? So where do y'all think these catfish go to be processed? Overseas, but where overseas? China. China. So all these catfish from Mississippi get shipped all the way to China to be slaughtered, packaged, and then sent back where? To Mississippi. Because Mississippi, catfish is basically, I think the latest study is something like 40% of the meat intake or the protein intake of people in Mississippi. We eat a lot of catfish, right? So it's like, it don't make no sense to send catfish that was probably produced within a 100-mile radius of somebody in Mississippi all the way to China that didn't be sent right back to Mississippi to be eaten. Makes no sense at all. To be sold back to us, right? To be sold back to us. It makes no sense. From an environmental sense or it makes no sense. And this is not sustainable, right? In no fundamental way is a system like this sustainable. And we saw some elements of that in real time during the pandemic. Let's not forget, there were some critical lessons that came out of the pandemic. Number one, I'm sorry I'm taking too long, but one, don't never let anybody tell you that the climate crisis is too big to be managed. And why do I say that? I want y'all to think about what happened in March, April, and May of 2020. We all lived through it. Everybody here lived through it. Y'all know what happened? Global trade came to a halt. To an absolute halt. And did we all starve? No. Did the sky fall? No. Right? Did carbon emissions go down tremendously? Yes. Right? Was there major restoration of animal populations, deer showing up in San Francisco, coyotes, coming back? Yes. Right? Was there major wetland restoration in a couple of places in a short period of time? Yes. So this whole argument, they're arguing that like all these cops, this COP 28 is going on right now, right? And all this, well, it's so complicated in the world economy. Like, wait a minute, we lived through a period where y'all made a decision to just stop trading in this international trade, and the world economy did not collapse. Civilization did not come to an end. So we have in living memory and practical aspect, it don't have to be this way. And y'all are keeping it this way because it gives certain advantage to a limited amount of people. Point blank, period. Right? We also saw, and this was kind of pre the pandemic, there was a period from, December 2019 to roughly May 2020, oil companies were giving away oil. Y'all remember that? Go back and look at it. The price of oil fell so bad that the oil companies had to just give it away. You remember? They were giving it away. Yeah, wholesale, just like, here, take it, right? And we need to interrogate why. And like they stopped having to produce because there was so much of a glut. And again, the world didn't stop, right? Things kept going along, right? Then that they made up for that deliberately by then charging us out the yin yang so they can get their profits back up. But I want to just point out, like, we actually lived through some things which already pointed that there could be a different way of doing things within our lifetime. That's contrary to a lot of the arguments that we often hear. It's too big, it's too dynamic, it's too complex, it would take, too many players, or things couldn't work. And then I want to point to another one around the climate piece. I want everybody to look at, both in its complexity but also in the dynamics. Last year in Sri Lanka, right, there was a mass movement which dispelled the government that was in power. And the piece that kind of precipitated that was Sri Lanka's economy had collapsed in part because they could not import oil. There was an oil shortage, a massive oil shortage in the country, right? And inflation, I think it rose something like 500%, right? It was just outrageous. And they're still in the midst. I just did an interview with some activists there this past Friday. Thursday, excuse me, I'm getting my time, on Thursday. And I really wanted to home, I've been asking them for a while, like I really want y'all to tell y'all story because the world is not hearing how y'all are adjusting in real time to not having oil. How does a country, function without having oil, like in this day and age? Like y'all are doing it. Like as far as I know, I haven't heard any mass reports of people starving in the streets, or there being a major famine, or like y'all are doing it, and how people are doing it. It was like, oh yeah, because we're just being forced to survive under new terms and conditions, we're not thinking about the things that we're adjusting to. And what they said, what we're adjusting to, we're going back to methods of production we were using 400 or 500 years ago. Right? And there's some changes. People saying some people, they eat less very consciously and deliberately. Right, but they're in it, and they kind of have to because a lot of the hospitals collapse. But they're also looking at, okay, people have lost weight, but some of the other health indicators, like the diabetes, has gone down. Right, and some of the other things have gone down because you're kind of being forced to a certain extent to be in line with the food choices that are within your natural environment. And guess what? Most of the people who live in Sri Lanka, their ancestors have been there for quite a long time. And so the native plants and foods that they were eating to adapt to that place, their body's actually probably more in tune to deal with that than to deal with McDonald's. So you get better health outcomes if you kind of be in a different relationship with the environment that your DNA actually is now literally suited to deal with and adjust to. So we got some things in living examples right now that we're not really talking about, I think, enough, or kind of like really drawing on the lessons of what happened. Because one of the things that to me that this piece around like when we kind of get overwhelmed by how large the climate crisis really is, as I always tell people, now go back to those 3 months, and what you witness is that when there is clear enough political will, the governments of the world actually can act with deliberate speed. And we should not expect or accept anything otherwise, because we've already witnessed it. And I'm not one who wants to rely upon the nation. Don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to rely on the nation states for any solutions. But those entities do exist. We do have to deal with them. And to the extent that they still exist, we have to pressure them to do what we need them to do in real time, particularly around this issue. So we can't accept like, no, this is too complex or too hard to deal with. Like, no, I just watched you, you stopped trade within a heartbeat when you felt like it was going to be life or death. Well, look, this is a life or death issue. Like for many of us, this is already a life or death issue. And how we came to this piece around being kind of ecologically centered, just so folks know, what woke us up in Mississippi was Hurricane Katrina. Because we saw in real time from Hurricane Katrina, it was like, oh, I remember one of these people, I've been following the Rio stuff since I was, in college, and got a chance to go to a number of different COPs, but it totally changed my understanding of it when I had to actually be on the ground and being like, wait a minute, climate change is not something that's coming, because that's kind of always like, it's here. It's here now. And for me, like the practical sense of it is like, it's impacting my people now. So I'm not going to wait for somebody to try to come up with policies and programs to help us. We got to do it ourselves. And that's what Cooperation Jackson was born. That's why this piece was so central to us. It's like, we need solutions that we can start working on ourselves instead of just waiting for somebody to say, oh, we might get around to it. Like, no, I can't might for my survival, right? I got to put much of what I can determine in my own hands, and that of my community for us to deal with. And that's what our program has been centered around. And I would just tell y'all from a practical thing of what I've seen and heard in terms of the work many of you, I think, are involved in, is starting with the land in a very systemic way. That is, I would argue, hard that that is the fundamental place that you want to go to, and then build your program and any policy on the basis of being in a different relationship with the land. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Just real quick, you touched on a couple of the different points. I wonder if you could just share really quickly, you talk about model. I'm hearing some of the points that come into the build and fight formula. Can you just real quick kind of give I know it's a whole other night's topic conversation right there in itself, but give a broad overview of that formula and how that's being rolled out.
Yeah, so the build and fight formula is something that we've been pushing as a program of kind of radical social transformation. And what it's premised on is a notion that it is easier for us to act our way into new ways of thinking than it is to think our way into new ways of acting. Right? Like, you know, build habits, build culture. Then you think you can come up with theories that say, oh, I did this for this reason, when actually it's like you probably did it the other way. You probably did something out of necessity that created a new thought, right? And so what our argument basically is, if you guys look at it, you know, we're constantly trying to play with this thing, is that we're saying, I'm not asking necessarily anybody to change their, first and foremost at this point, to change your political ideology or your views. And that may sound strange coming from me and everything you heard said. I really want to build community with everybody, regardless of what you believe, in fundamental ways that are going to improve the quality of life for all of us, around a certain core set of practices that we can all do in our local community. And one of the principal things around this argument, particularly amongst, you know, the folks kind of like in the progressive, the social movement left of the left, we often have a deficit mentality. Like we've grown to start thinking first and foremost of what we don't have, right? And my argument, our argument, Cooperation Jackson, we don't take enough stock of what we actually do have, right, and what we are doing. And that I would argue that, like, in this community, if you look at all the small projects that are doing some element of food justice work, if you add it all up, you might have a legitimate program of food sovereignty already. The weakness of it is people aren't coordinated, right? And they aren't planning enough to deal with the food caloric intake. Let's just start there, to deal with the caloric intake on the community from local productive activities, right? And so it's kind of like we have our own little novel projects of, I'm doing this here because it makes me feel good, or it makes me give, you know, whatever the reason. I'm like, to me, I'm like, I don't care. What I do think is certain, like, we all need to eat, right? And we all need better health outcomes, right, in our community, and we all need it to be cheaper. So we all agree upon that. Like, those are things, you know, like what I think, regardless of what we all believe in politically, I bet you we could all agree on that, right? Better food, better access, cheaper, right? Now, I don't care if you're Republican, Democrat, Independent, I think you could agree on that. Now, how we get to those points, we may wind up different, but the piece is, let's start with that. And let's figure out, how do we do the level of planning and coordination to meet our community needs? And what our argument is, the build and fight formula, is that what is missing is the connective glue around a certain set of clear objectives of meeting both our climate, you know, kind of needs, but also improving the quality of life needs. And what we are arguing, that if you look at all, so the first is kind of like in a programmatic order. So if you look at how there's a little sheet that we put up, it kind of looks like a random assortment of things. Actually, it's not, right? And we have to spell that out more. So the first thing that's on there, that's articulated there, is mutual aid. And mutual aid in this sense is just a shorthand of we are providing, food shelters and clothes banks and all this to meet needs, and almost every of our communities is doing that, right? But there's the particular piece of why we're starting there. Because one of the pieces that sometimes we have a hard time knowing on a sound basis is what are the real concrete needs of the vast majority of people in our communities. And the mutual aid piece, like if we went to all the soup kitchens and food banks and the housing, relief agencies, you'll get a much clearer picture of who really needs what. Right, and we all know that there's some level of like public administration and folks that deal with these issues, but they deal with them in silos. Like the folks who do food can't talk to the folks who do housing, right? They cannot share information with each other on the government level. On a certain, they do in different ways, but like it's supposed to be very regimented and segmented. And I would argue that's one of these systemic features that keep the poverty machine going, rather than trying to alleviate it. And there's a reason why that the poverty machine is kind of necessary to keep wages down. Just in simple terms, let's just be real. So if we want to disrupt that, we have to figure out how do we engage in mutual aid with this aspect of figuring out what people need. That leads to the next parts are how do we actually meet what people need based upon local production. So this Build and Fight formula, the next component of it is food sovereignty as a goal and objective for each community, like within a bioregional kind of perspective, right? And the critical piece that we're saying around like the mutual aid, so I want folks to be clear, it's data, if we want to engage in these practices, because they're right to do it. Us taking care of each other is the right thing to do. But gathering information and being systemic about it to determine need leads us to one of the weaknesses that we have of kind of the traditional mutual aid that might come from, say, like an anarchist source. And what's one of the fundamental weaknesses about how we do mutual aid in this country, or in a lot of places, right? We're dependent upon the productive capacity of the general market. So, like for us, we do a lot of hurricane relief. Hurricanes come through our area every year, and some community gets destroyed. We're now, because of climate change, the tornado alley is actually way all the way over to Alabama now. So Mississippi has been hit by tornadoes, like in our area, but hit by a lot of tornadoes. So every year, like the past 4 years, we've done some tornado relief. There was one bad when they came through earlier this year that we did a lot. We took a lot of aid. Well, we're going to Walmart or we're going to Costco or someplace like that to buy water, to buy supplies, to then take up there. And what we're trying to make an argument is like we need to produce on the local level, knowing that these things are coming. We can start at least producing the food and storing it and packing it and processing, which then what? Increases the productive capacity, creates more jobs. Like if we start thinking about how do we direct our needs in this particular way, we actually put ourselves in a position to both fight climate change but meet people's immediate needs. So it's a way of ascertaining kind of like need, but then also rooting in social reproduction work. So that's another component of the mutual aid point that we haven't totally figured out how to say that, but I want to just say it here, is that one of the big weaknesses of the left is like we haven't found a fundamental way of making social reproduction visible and distinct, and like operationalizing, other than sometimes making arguments around, well, child care should be equal. Of course it should be, but how do we actually turn that into a culture and make a political operative program around it? That's part of what we want to do there. But the food sovereignty piece, and then the piece around worker self-organization, is saying once we know what these needs are, we now need to orient our local production to meet these needs. Not necessarily to meet a whole bunch of market, potential, not so much that. And the piece that what we're arguing for within this Build and Fight formula, that when you actually look at in almost every community, what the productive capacities actually are, so much of what is like any local factory around here, it's not producing to service the needs here. It's producing to serve markets wherever the market may be, which is often not here. Right, whatever it is, if it's wood, if it's food, whatever, it's often not oriented around here. Well, can we re-articulate that to be like, well, how do we produce for what people here need? Right, and can we convert the productive shops and capacities towards that? Right, and then the other component of that is digital fabrication, and then the other component around, like, all of this is it sounds great, but if there is no broad way of making democratic decisions around how all these goods and services are distributed and produced, and you got to have both, then it's meaningless, right? And so that's why the next rung of that is, you can call it what you want, we call them people's assemblies. And what we want these people's assemblies to do is make determinations on a broad sense around resource allocation and distribution, and also to do a level of planning. Right, like, how are we going to, like, 5 years from now, if we know we're going to keep getting hit by tornadoes, right, and we know we're going to keep getting, like, let's not be blind to reality. We know these hurricanes are keep coming. They're going further and further inland. They're becoming more and more destructive. We actually need to start thinking about maybe some folks don't need to be on the coast because they destroyed the wetlands so much that there's nothing to stop them from just coming straight up. So maybe can we come up as a broad community of saying, let's do an experiment for the next 20 years where we rewild this whole area along the coast, let all the marshlands and the wetlands and all that stuff kind of restore, but we do it intentionally, because we're not going to leave it to the market to relocate these communities. We have to figure out, like, where could people go? Where do they want to go? How do we ensure that they have the housing and stuff that we need? Those are broad democratic decisions that should not and could not, if we're being just about it, like the just transition, if we're being just about it, should be left up to folks. And we also need, for me, I would say we need to be, I'm not one of these conservationists who believe that you just rewild things and that doesn't include people. That's nonsense. Like, that we are part of the earth, we are part of the environment, and part of it, like, to the extent that we destroy it, we also are this key element to restoring it. So there needs to be a right of return kind of component to it, but, like, you can only do this kind of stuff through broad democratic decision making, right? Not something that's imposed upon below. So that this level of community planning that you have to do, right? You have to do the community construction first. That goes back to the mutual aid. But you have to also create and enable these broad decision-making processes. And the government could be, I argue with folks, the level of which the current government structures should be involved, that's really left up for each community to determine. So for me, for instance, my local municipal government, if things were just left up to them, I could work with them and would work with them, right? Because we share in a lot of values. We definitely share in a lot of the same interests. But where we stopped oftentimes in our practice in Mississippi, at least right now, is when we come up with good ideas, that Republican supermajority I was telling you about, then they just say, oh, we're going to ban that. We're going to create a policy which says you can't do that, right? They call it preventative policy making. So, like, for instance, we've been having a Fight for 15 campaign in Jackson for about 20 years, even before the national kind of got launched. We now have a city council which is prepared to make a decision like that. Soon as the current governor got in with this new super majority, before they had a super majority, but it could be challenged. Now they got the super majority since 2017. One of the first thing they did, no municipality can set its own employee structure rate, right? Like, everything, including government contracts, have to be mediated by the market, right? And so, and then the stuff that we put forward, our little ragtag organization that we put forward is ideas. Just to tell one story, we came back from one of the COPs, I think it was the one that was in Peru, and we were just doing an accountability thing. Three of our folks went to this other country, took time, energy, resources, got on these planes, went and spent all this. We got to come back. You come back, you share the knowledge, you share the experience, so to bring in the broad community. So we just had a community discussion, and in the community discussion, we had talked about what about the current treaty documents that they was kind of doing. This was like COP 19, I think it was, or 21, one of the two of them. And just on the basis of a local news channel coming to our office, right, coming to our community center and did a report, group goes to the United Nations. The next week, there was a bill that was introduced saying the state of Mississippi will not abide by any UN climate change agreement negotiation. And it got passed because 3 people went to another country to talk about climate change and mention the United Nations. Not a mass movement, like 3 people, and we were like, all right. We said, you know what? We're not, when we do these type of reports around certain issues, we're not going to call the media no more, for sure. But we'll just have to do it more kind of word of mouth, so they don't create bad policy or restrictive policy. And we've gotten into a place, you know, quite frankly, on a certain level, we just like, look, we just need to do the things that we feel are necessary within our capacity and resource ability to do. And just try to mediate it with the city council to have approval. So it's like do it first and ask for permission later, right? So we're not telegraphing too much of what it is we're trying to do so they can just come in and ban it. So, you know, strategy, you know, within the context. But this build and fight formula is something that we are trying to get everybody to look at and adopt. But the critical piece that we're arguing with folks, I want to go back and end on this point. The main argument is we got to get out of deficit thinking, right? Because, you know, we would argue that if you look at every single community, we are doing enough that we could actually meet a lot of our needs. We're just not coordinated enough. We're not dialoguing with each other enough. We don't have community and trust amongst each other enough that we can actually do this to scale to meet our needs. So it's an argument about scaling that's not like, you know, yes, do I want more people to farm? Yes, I do want more people to do that. Do I want more people to do community production? I do want people to do that. But the folks who are already doing it, I would like for y'all to dialogue with the folks who are doing the farming to figure out, like, how do we do X, Y, and Z? Because another critical piece of it, and I heard it mentioned earlier, you know, like a lot of the stuff around digital fabrication that we use, it requires, it's got a foot in the old economy in that it requires a lot of plastics and resins. All right, we already know enough that we don't have to use petrochemicals being extracted from the oil industry to produce the materials that we need. Like, we can actually gain a lot of the resins from plants, right, and create another piece. So we need to transition production. That's why, like, there's practical reasons why we need the growers to talk, to be in community with these folks who are doing the maker spaces and the fab labs and all that kind of stuff, to articulate and develop a new method of production that is far more sustainable, right, and that utilizes local materials and not have to rely upon all these, you know, excessive supply chains. But it requires us to create the demand, and that requires us to be in communication with each other. So at its root, it's an argument for greater local community building, coordination, and planning.
We have a few minutes for folks. If you have a question you'd like to ask a colleague, now's your chance.
Yes.
Can you talk to that last point about what are some strategies that have worked for coordinating, for lighting the fire, for getting people working together and making things happen?
I mean, I would say for us, we are now growing. You know, we are starting to experiment with what I just told you, producing our own resins, right? And there's a process of us now trying to learn and building the capacity of taking the things that we, you know, it's shifting some of the things of what we're producing and being able to kind of make this big shift. And for us, I would say talk to us in about a year to 2 years time, and let me say why. Medical cannabis is now legal in Mississippi, and so we're getting into that. When we're getting into that with the full knowledge that the cannabis industry is not the bellwether big money thing that people thought it was going to be in here in California, large parts of it are collapsing. So we're not entering in it with no illusions. We're entering with it. I'm interested in cannabis because it introduces us in our state to open up the ability for us to do various types of hemp. And a deeper level, because the hemp licenses in Mississippi used to be limited. Now they're opening them up, right? I want to do hempcrete. I want to do hemp resins. I want to do hemp clothes, right? And this just opens up that door and positions us to be in the capacity for that. So it's like we've already experimented. We've already went to a couple of places and know that it's possible based upon the production that they're doing. And what we're going to do is marry that with our community production capacity. Right? And so we've toyed around with it. We did some masks during the COVID piece. Most of that was made with traditional plastic, but the last couple of ones and some of the stuff that team is doing now is totally being made out of vegetable resins, not like any plastics. We haven't perfected it yet, but we're getting there. And so we're doing, and it's at a place where we are making the resins. We're not buying it from somebody else. We are doing that ourselves at this point. Right, based upon a lot of the compost stuff that we are grabbing, and we got a lot of like, well, how much feed do we need? There's a lot of things that we're trying to figure out, but I can tell you, I'm already looking ahead. We are on the right course to meet our overall goals and objectives. I'm just citing what we are doing. I can, I would tell you to look up Insight Focus for a deeper sense around this notion around community production. It's a group based out of Detroit and Idlewild, Mississippi, that we've got a lot of our training from. And then some of the better examples of things I've seen, actually, there's a project in Ghana, there's a project in Senegal, and there's a project in South Africa. And they're in a united kind of core with each other. And what they have been doing is cleaning all of their, what do you want to call it, the riverbeds and sewer systems, cleaning of all this excess plastic, recycling their self and turning that into like new housing materials and stuff to take it out to clean the rivers. And they're doing all of this by themselves. And they're still trying to figure out the leaching problem of all the chemicals that they still have. But it's the level of which they've kind of cleared their natural environment of all this unwanted plastic that's out there and waste has been tremendous. So I could send you the name of that. It's kind of escaping me right now what the name of the piece is. But I went out there and saw some of this myself, trying to figure out like, okay, how do y'all to figure something out? We have not to the same level that they have by any means, but we have some of the same dynamics. And we're like, how do we bring this knowledge and apply it to us? And we learned some techniques of refining that we're trying to bring from them. So just a few examples of how this could work. The food productive stuff, that is far more advanced. And I would tell you to look at some of the stuff that La Via Campesina is doing, particularly in Brazil, Argentina, and then some of the stuff that they are also doing in Angola and South Africa as well.
I love that you mentioned the maps, and I work on some history projects of history that people aren't really familiar with. And how you mentioned how it was really important for your collective and to understand the history of your area. How do you get people interested in those topics? In your group, because generally people aren't they don't lean toward that interest, right? So how do you do it?
For us, it's primarily situated around what's the work that we're doing, right? And around like the community production, I'll cite that. We always try to get people to understand first and foremost, like what's the black contribution to whatever the hell we're doing, right? Because oftentimes that story is not told, right? And so we had where's that sister from? She was teaching in Alabama, and she came. This was about a year before that movie about the black women who worked for NASA. She told us that story. I didn't know that. Now, I consider myself a severe history buff. She came and told us that story about, you see this she called them CNCs machines, which is basically what a lot of digital, CNC stands for computer numeric, computer numeric, what's the C, the last C? Control, right? And it's basically just getting a machine to read something in 3 dimensions and then, like mimicking its production to make it short and sweet. And so she came and gave us a breakdown, like the mathematical techniques and the computations that were used to get people to go, to the moon. They wind up being embedded in a lot of this technology, right? And so, like, I want you to see yourself in this. Right, and your people's history and ground, and that's the method. I know I do that with my kids about. Well, I don't want to do with X, Y, and Z, because I think a large part of it was, I know, at least for me, I was one of these folks in generation that I grew up in. Was kind of certain things you didn't get involved in that because that's what white people did. Like, that's white people shit. I don't want to. I don't want to deal with that, or you acting white or you're thinking white. And it was always folks to be like, nah, we created that. And let me give you a history of how we used to do it. And then once I could see myself in it, it made it less frightening, right? And so, like, for me, I was always a science kind of nerd kind of kid, but I was always intimidated by math, on a certain level. One, because, most of the teachers I had, they just didn't believe in black boys could count, basically, from where I was at least at a critical time when I was learning some of these skills. And so, but once I kind of could see myself in it, it just gave me a different confidence of, like, okay, I might struggle with this now, but, if somebody like me did it, I know it just kind of gave me this confidence. If somebody like me did it, then I can do it. And that, to me, just extended, in a confidence and something I tell my kids. There's nothing that any human being has ever done that you can't do. Period. I don't care what they look like. Right? Like, we all got the same brain capacity. It's just a matter of we're going to use it, have the discipline and the focus to utilize it. And anything that you want to do, you're going to have to put in the time, energy, and effort to, like, learn it and do it. But if you want to be a great mathematician, there's nothing stopping you other than your own imagination to accomplish that. Now, don't lie to them and say that you can go apply that in the world, because that requires dealing with the systems that exist. But you at least acquiring the knowledge and having the confidence to do it. So we use that same methodology. And I can tell you from our experience, I think it works pretty profoundly. We also have the benefit, though, like, Mississippi is a very history-laden place. You just kind of got to uncover it a little bit. And what we've often found is Mississippi is also a great place, and people will bait you into thinking that they're not as smart as they are. And you kind of, got to go underneath the surface, and, they're going to play with you like, it's kind of to my advantage given a white supremacy, suppressive society. Like, I survived by there's a history of I survived by staying out the way, right? And so there's a long history of not talking up, or being out of place. But you often find, particularly with some folks, you be sitting there saying it, and they'll just drop here, like, blah, 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 like, you knew about this then all along, didn't you? Like, yeah, kind of, I was just letting you go along kind of thing. But what is good at a lot of time is we always try to bring in elders from the community, regardless of what we're doing around certain things, to tell people about what came before. And one of the things why that's important to me is I want our members, and our membership is mainly young folks, like under 30. So I'm kind of old in our organization's context. I'm one of the older ones. And one of the things that I want them to get a understanding of is the nature of the intergenerational struggle that it takes to kind of move something. And then there's also this notion that we haven't done nothing before, or it's been a challenge, and I want to get people like, no, your people have done some remarkable stuff. And the things that we're doing, believe me, people have tried before, and I need you to have a deeper understanding as to why, quote unquote, it didn't work. And oftentimes it's not that it didn't work, it was destroyed. And so I want to give you an understanding of we are here to produce this, but I'm not going to lie to you and say there's not some forces who are threatened by what we're doing and who don't have intentions on coming and harming us. So I want you to be aware, because there's the element that we are very clear within our politics of, we call it the build and fight formula, right? And like so much of our movement, we're like, yeah, we got to fight all the bad stuff, but we also got to put at least equal, in my view, greater time in building the things that we want. But we better be prepared to defend them, right, to the greatest extent possible, or understand like when it's time to move and shift, right? Because not all things are defensible or should be, right? And some things have a season of life and they should die. Right, and we shouldn't be ashamed of that. Like, okay, this existed for the time it needed to exist, and let it go, so something else can move, breathe, and live. Right, but being clear, did it accomplish the objectives, and be clear about what the objectives are coming for. But like really trying to ground people, for us, is like every project has a history. To answer your question, and for folks to be grounded in that history, and I think we are now getting at a place where, like starting, Jackson's 80% black, so we're gonna start with our own frame of reference. But the other piece is like, hey, other people have done X, Y, and Z. So, because I want you to see yourself as part of the world and not excluded from it, and that's important for y'all in our context. I just want y'all to, like most people born in Jackson, they have not left the people. They've not left the very few. A lot of folks have never been out of the state of Mississippi. And like one of the things that kind of has become a draw to certain young people about our organization, we facilitate a lot of our young people doing international travel, right? So it's basically a requirement. If you join Cooperation Jackson, you're gonna get a passport. Like that's a kind of a membership requirement now, not stated in our bylaws, but like, I was telling, get your papers together, you get your, I don't want you to be trapped here. That's why I pray. I don't want you to be trapped here. Get some stuff together. God wants you to go see the world. And my objective is that, at least on a material level, one of the things I always try to get out of some of our folks' heads, man, it's so hard here, nothing can be done here. Be like, all right, let me bring you to Africa. Some of the places that I have relationships with and projects I'm working with extensively, they got a fraction of resources or access to capital like we do, and doing wonders. And just showing people like your limitation is in your mind. The limitation is in the mind. Like we don't need a whole bunch of money to do certain kind of things. We actually don't. Right? But until you ground and seeing somebody like your question, like where is this happening? Right? Show me in the real world. I'm gonna be like, hey, check this out. This is what's going on. Or check out what's going on in India. With this, or look at what some of our folks are doing up in the Andes. Check this out. And you're like, okay, like your budget is 100 times more than theirs. I mean, your living expenses are more, but like we got far more resources than most of the people that we ally with. And so I always come back with a challenge. Are we doing everything we can with the resources that we have? And I always have the people like, don't be ashamed of what we've done, but we can do a lot more. Right? So that's that piece around the travel, the exposure. That's a critical piece of what I think we've been able to do. That's kind of enhance folks, ability to like kind of learn these things. So, any other question?
So I I hear that there's so many young people involved, and I'm just curious about, as far as like looking into the future, what you're seeing or how you cultivate what leadership would be in the cooperation model. And do you see these people as naturally kind of moving into a place that you will see it continue, into the next generation? Are you intentionally doing anything around that, or do you just kind of see it happening organically as they understand the intergenerational nature of what they're doing?
Both. I mean, we are trying right now and going through a kind of a very intentional leadership transition. So I'm trying to transition myself out of my role very consciously and deliberately. For a lot of different reasons. Like one, I'm very mindful that this is a Jackson piece, and even though I got deep Mississippi roots in history, I'm an LA boy. I wasn't born and raised there. So having leadership that's born and raised there is very important to me, and it's one of my own measures of have I done my job successfully by bringing folks from here into the leadership, right? And so we're doing a very intentional piece around that, and it's not going as fast as I would like, but it is happening. And then there's just organic, kind of leadership development stuff, which is happening. It's kind of bound to happening. And then there's also like intergenerational struggles too. So we've had our fair degree of that. I think we're at a new medium around that. So one of the things that in our environment, which was a difficult one, just to name it, them has no difficulties. We have a lot of, because we have a high young membership, they're very much rooted in a very gender fluid reality, which older members of our community, which is a very Christian, in the Bible Belt, very Christian community, that ain't their orientation at all. Now that don't mean that they deeply homophobic or transphobic, but for them it's like, I see a man, I see a woman. So calling you they, or they like so we had like a 3 or 4 year period where there was serious tension a lot of times between some of the older folks and some of the young. They misgendered me or just identified me, like, okay, me being kind of in the middle, I was like, I'm not trying to make any excuse for anybody, but being socialized one way for 60 years is not going to change just because you told somebody you want to be identified another way one time. That's not going to happen. And that doesn't mean if they misidentify you that they are your enemy. That's what I need you to understand. Like the young folks, we're going to work on them of giving you the respect that you want and you deserve. But that, that's a worldview that it's going to be hard. And if we was to struggle with some of the old folks, like, why they want to do this? And it doesn't make any sense. Why they're making things more complicated. It's like, you got to allow them to live in the world that they want to create. Right? Like me and you, we lived in a different world. Let them live in the world that they want to create. Like, is it hurting you? Or is it oppressing you in some way? Like, if the answer is basically no, then let it be. Right? It may not be your reality, but just let it be. You ain't got to accept it, understand it, but just if it's hurting you in some way, like somebody doing something to you, restricting your freedom, that's a different thing. And so we've kind of got to a meeting where people are like, okay, I don't fully agree with it, but it's within the democratic culture that we're trying to create. Like, many worlds can exist, even in our small space, right? But it was two struggles that was going on. One was some of the young folks being quick on the draw, like, I'm gonna retract because I don't. They don't use the language, and I would often say, like, look, if you expect people to walk in that door perfect, right, using the all the language that you want them to use, you're gonna be working by yourself. I can tell you that right now. You need to stop and get this up and just go stay in your house and don't come outside, because that's not the world that we live in. Like, ain't nobody gonna step through that door perfect, not nobody, right? And we all gonna have to be in here learning with each other. So be open to learning and be open to struggling. Everything ain't gonna be perfect. Don't, but the main thing was like, just, understand who is your enemy, what is your enemy, is a big piece around this that we had to do. And within that, leadership, going back to your question, leadership has definitely emerged in both directions, kind of like organically the bridges. But education is at the center of what we do. So let me put that just to make it clear, right? And if anything, some of our co-op development process by many people's account is too slow. Right, because there's a number of different things. Like, no, I want you to be very grounded in, there's a way in which you can do this, which might make a lot more money, but if that money may be the process may be harmful to the environment. It may not be in sync with other values and principles of things we want to do. So how do we get those things in line? Political education goes hand in hand in everything we do with the formal technical education, and within that, grounded within that, is a leadership development process. So we're very intentional about that. And for me, as one of the primary designers and leaders of it, it's the model that I grew into. I was blessed to be in a political organization that at every point that I was involved in it, there was intergenerational kind of, tracks and leadership kind of components. Now, looking back on that, that was a strong benefit, and it's a culture that I've tried to keep and implement so that takes place. Because without that, I wouldn't be here, right? And if you within the movement space that I come out of, I was originally tracked to be security. Not anything of what I'm doing now. That's what I was kind of in line to do, was to be movement security, and I fully wholeheartedly embraced that, right? And I'm still very much like that on a certain level. And it's just I stepped up into at different points in time. Although there's a gap here, right? Or the mission calls for us to do this, and we don't have the skills. So I'd be like, well, let me learn. Let me try to do it. And some people are like, oh, you write grants, great. And I said, that's a lie. I didn't know how to do that at first. I did it because I had to do it at a certain point in time. And then after a lot of failure, about a decade of failing at it, and then figuring out over time, it doesn't matter how well you write. You got to actually create some relationships, right? Because I've seen people write trash and get it, but I was trying to figure it out. I'd be mad. How y'all get all that money? And I read your application. It was terrible, blah, blah, blah. It was all these misspelled words, and the grammar was bad. How y'all get there? I'd be like, oh, wait a minute. You knew the program officer who knew okay, so you spent, I was like, I've been going about this all wrong, and wasn't nobody pulling my card to be like, well, this is actually what you need to do, right? And so, trying to pass on those lessons of okay, you can do this the hard way, or you can listen to those who kind of walk before you and figure out that there's a methodology to do it. You may not agree with it all, but at least sit down and take the time to try to learn from it.
Okay, so I think we're here, right? This isn't the end. This is the end. The limitation to your mind. And I think that's some key words out of all the wonderful sharing that has taken place tonight. Limitation, it's here, right? So as we move forward, how do we wrestle with the challenges that we have in this time? With that, one of the ways that we learned from being in Hawaii is that when we would come together and there would be prayers or there'd be things said, that they end it with 2 claps. And it's a particular clap. It's not a cupped clap. It's a slap clap. And what that does, in a way, is it sends the intention, it sends the words, it sends the energy out. So together, if we may wrap this up tonight, this part, with 2 claps, that would be great. We're going to do it on count, right? So maybe the rhythm will be like this. This is the tester. It'd be like, okay, so ready?